Hi, welcome to Orgone Continuum TV number 8, to this month's little paper, as it were, video paper. Just this month, I'm going to go through part 2 of one of my published papers on Psych Orgone, which is psychorgone.com, the Journal of Psychiatric Orgone Therapy, which covers psychiatric orgone therapy, sociology, philosophy, weather engineering, orgone biophysics, all sorts of things, and quite a cutting edge journal. So, or actually the only cutting edge journal in orgonomy. So, let's continue on from where we left off last month. Last month we looked at the kind of philosophical backgrounds, at the different types of theories that you can use to understand what reality is. We looked at dualism, materialism, panpsychism, and how they relate to orgone. And I kind of came out with a bit of a panpsychic orgone theory, but then I've developed it further since then. It's more, it's almost, you could class it as a form of objective idealism or Germanic idealism, but that's not far from panpsychism in any way. Anyway, you can go back to last month's video if you're interested in the philosophical background. So the next paper, which is Implications of Orgone for Consciousness Research Part 2, I looked at last month. The only thing I left out last month, funny enough, was what was Reich's view of consciousness, and Reich had what you could call a systems theory view of consciousness. He believed that consciousness was an effect of a dynamic system interacting, orgone and a membrane, creating perception, and then those membranes coming together and creating a conscious, self-conscious unit. But there's problems with emergence theories. But some people who think consciousness somehow emerges out of non-consciousness, that implies dualism, and dualism implies that there's that one consciousness comes out of non-consciousness, which is very problematic philosophically, because you can't say how consciousness and material ultimately are related, or consciousness and energy. Anyway, to go to this month's paper, right, I'll just read you the introduction. The theory of organotic panpsychism, the orgone continuum, with supporting evidence from various scientific fields, has already been outlined in part 1 of the series. A tripartite theory of a single orgone continuum with 3 aspects: physical organotic consciousness, orgone energy, and orgone matter, has been proposed. The first paper in this series, a critique of previous theories of consciousness, explored how both the mainstream and traditional Reichian views of consciousness are inadequate. However, if orgone is viewed as conscious in itself, which this writer has proposed, then a new orgonomic theory of consciousness may have direct implications for technology, experimentation, and computing. Just to butt in on myself there a little bit, there's never been an orgonomic theory of consciousness. My own theory is pretty much the first fully worked out theory of consciousness in orgonomy, because Reich's theory of consciousness wasn't an orgonomic theory, it was a systems theory, and it didn't work in any case. Well, it worked to an extent. You could explain through Reich's theories, you could explain emotions, like when energy is going outwards, you've got generally positive emotions, and when it's contracting inwards, you've got negative emotions. And you could also explain um, sort of how perception occurs in a cell, like but it gets stuck because you have to have something non-conscious producing something conscious, or something non-living producing life, because life's always associated with consciousness. So Reich's theories really were systems theories. So anyway, to go back to what I was saying, then a new orgonomic theory of consciousness may have direct implications for technology, experimentation, and computing. This is because it would elucidate a universal consciousness field as a real entity usable technologically. That's the problem with a lot of people who say, well, there's a quantum field of consciousness, and say, well, everything's conscious. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but show me the money. You know what I mean? If you want to say there's a universal field of consciousness, let's have a universal field that's real and that you can measure with a machine, not just an imaginary one. So that's where the Orgone view of consciousness, or the Orgone Continuum, is takes us into new fields, I think, because it means that if Orgone itself is conscious, then it means we can have consciousness technology, because you've got the actual energy that is conscious. You've not got something like, you could say, well, when I wheel my arm around like that, that produces the consciousness of movement, or that, or when matter does this, that produces the consciousness of some kind of experience. But that but a hand moving or an arm moving is not consciousness itself. It's just a well, in a way, it is consciousness itself, but uh, we don't know. We haven't had, if we say that consciousness is a field effect, and ultimately it's a universal field, unless we can have a physically real universal field that correlates, or that actually is the body of that consciousness, then it's not usable technologically. Whereas an orgonomic view of consciousness might well be usable in a technology sense. A new orgonomic theory of consciousness could help lead to true artificial intelligence, this writer believes. However, even the terms and analogies which are commonly used today in the field of artificial intelligence are confused and need addressing in order to assist progress. So I go into the names of things. Like, firstly, what is consciousness? Despite the mountain of words written on the subject, it's not a difficult thing. It can be defined simply as any and all subjective experience. A person has subjective experience. It appears to be connected with being an organism. Organisms that appear to behave in similar ways to ourselves are labelled as having some degree of consciousness. And then we can say, so consciousness is any and all experience. So you can't say something is a little bit conscious, or say, well, there's perception and then there's intelligence and there's computing, and like, because current AI is not AI at all. It's just clever. It's just a clever machine for doing jobs, that you can't quite always predict what it's going to do, because it's using an algorithm. You can't quite predict what path it's going to do, but it's still a machine for doing jobs. The to be to call it artificial intelligence, well, the, So, well, for an example it being we've reduced the medical profession to AI. Doctors don't make decisions themselves much anymore. They follow algorithms, and they don't like to be outside what the big pharmaceutical companies and the powers that be lay down the the pathways, and they're expected to follow those pathways to the letter. So doctors have had their consciousness reduced to artificial intelligence. Whereas on the other hand, to say a machine is truly is a little bit conscious is rubbish. You, you something either has conscious subjective experience or not, and the things that, well, we only know for certain that that we are experiencing consciousness, or I am experiencing consciousness. We don't know anything else for certain, but we're pretty sure that other organisms are conscious because they behave in ways that we do. So that's if you wanted a true way of testing whether something is conscious or not, or whether it's correct to call something intelligent, then it, it, it might be informative to see if a machine or a program behaves like an organism, because organisms are what we've commonly aware of being conscious. So that I call it the doggy test. If a computer, like, you're pretty sure that if you got a pet dog, you're pretty sure that your pet dog's conscious. Well, and that's a feeling based on a number of judgments, complex judgments. And if you get that same feeling, a number of complex judgments about a computer or an artificial intelligence program, then yeah, maybe, but it's got to be not a some type of algorithm for deciding. It's a feeling. You get a feeling whether something's conscious or not, and certainly that takes me back to Orgone in some senses, because like my first study was looking at Orgone and acupuncture, and things that one of the conclusions I came to was that the Orgone energy and chi energy in acupuncture are almost certainly the same entity. And when you have acupuncture, so sometimes the energy behaves intelligently, like it has a mind of its own. It will decide, like, one point will activate for a while and then it will jump to another, and then a point that's not even been needled will start to activate. So if we got this chi energy that is conscious in itself, and we can kind of develop a chi or orgone based computer, or a computer that has chi or orgone as part of its functioning, then there's no reason, I believe, why true consciousness shouldn't be attached to a machine, just as we can have true consciousness attached to a biological entity. I don't use the word machine for organisms because we're we're an organism. So and we're not. A machine is made by an outside energy, an outside entity, to do tasks, and generally doesn't have volition or choice. And an organism is a pulsating, living thing that has its own goals, and and its own functioning, and functions in holographically with lots of other organisms, in holons. Like you got the brain functioning as a little mini organism inside the body, which is a bigger organism, and then one whole organism functioning within a group of other organisms, and so it's wholes within wholes. So that which is one of Sheldrake's ways of looking at things. So if a computer becomes like an organism and reminds you of your dog, then maybe it's conscious. I think that's better than the Turing test myself, because you can trick someone following an algorithm. So just tricking someone doesn't prove anything. That just means you've managed to trick someone. Judging whether something is conscious is much more complex than tricking someone. But I haven't read Turing himself. Maybe he had a more complex idea of it, and it's been oversimplified over the years. It's often what happens with great minds. What is an organism? It can be defined as a pulsating, autonomous, experiencing entity with its own volition. Actually, I skipped what is a computer. What is a computer? It can be defined as a machine for performing computations. Like we say, oh, a computer, we're computers, that's so great. Well, that's rubbish. This piece of orgonite crystal, that's a computer. Look, hold it here, drop it. I've just calculated how long a piece of material that size takes to go from there to there. So I've just done a complex computation, and that is not saying, I want my tea, I'm fed up. So it's not conscious, is it? But it can compute. So if you just do more and more of the same thing, it's not going to give you something different than it did before. It's just going to give you more and more complex computation, because thought is not computation. Anyway, I'm getting beyond myself. Let's go back to, I skipped what is a computer. What is a computer? It can be defined as a machine for performing computations, the storing or manipulating of information. A computer can be any object used to compute a sum, for example some weighing scales, or a box full of microchips that computes your journey to work. The principle is the same. And I've already covered what to define an organism as. But a pulsating, autonomous, experiencing entity with its own volition, quite different from a machine. Mainstream scientists do not generally know the difference between a machine and an organism, and yet they are trying to create artificial consciousness, which is an organism property. Generally, it might not always be an organism property, but 9 out of 10 in the mundane world it seems to be an organism property, not a machine property. Scientists also do not know the difference between computing, working out computations which a pencil, calculator, abacus, or an electronic computer can do, and an organism which is not a computer but something else entirely. And now this is why I wrote the first paper and concentrated mainly on philosophy. If the field of philosophy had not been banished from scientific thought so effectively, these simple aspects could have been realised and the field of information technology benefited earlier. However, those at the forefront of artificial intelligence have already grasped this intuitively, it appears. This can be ascertained in the attitude of those trying to develop artificial general intelligence. They are more interested in how organisms work things out, not how computers do it. So, yeah, sort of computing and AI is definitely going in a biological direction, and people are interested in how even the actual hardware is starting to go in a biological direction. People have got stuff called mesh and been using slime molds and all sorts of things. Like slime molds can do really complex calculations, and then I suppose quantum computing might head in a more, and the actual way the programs are being used are more biological as well. But I'll go into that shortly because I'll have to remind myself about it. The field of artificial intelligence is inherently confused in terms of its nomenclature, namings, because as soon as a computer is able to have true subjective experience, it would cease to be a computer and would in fact be an organism. So it's a self-defeating thing. You want to make a computer that's self-aware, well, fine. Once you got one, it won't be a computer. When strong artificial intelligence is truly created, computers will become biological or energetic entities to some degree. Now, here's my prediction, and you heard it here first, although it's been in sci-fi, but I think we'll have radioactive crystals and biological entities within the computers, and the computers will be self-aware, but we don't all have to go running and it's the end of the world. It's like there's good and evil in every human being, and you can get human beings born that are more connected to negativity, and you can get humans born that are more connected to positivity, and that you cannot create consciousness. I mean, maybe God can create consciousness, I don't know, but my feeling is all conscious entities are eternal. So maybe if you make a computer conscious, a computer network conscious, you might get some badass entity come in and cause trouble, or you might get a good one. Be a bit like humans. It's good and bad everywhere. So when consciousness becomes something that that a non-biological entity can have, a created by non-organism entity can have, then it'll just be spirits, or it'd be more spiritual than technological. Be like, hey, it's my voodoo PC, spirit in a box, connects straight into the spirit worlds. Just Google the higher realms. So anyway, yeah. So when strong artificial intelligence is truly created, computers will become biological or energetic entities to some degree, creating and I think that will be based on Orgone and crystals and biology. Creating self-modifying algorithms may not be the direct path to creating a silicone organism. Maths and algorithms are not an inherent property of organisms. They can be used to partially describe them, but consciousness itself is not complicated maths. So the actual experience of consciousness is not mathematical. You can describe how anything that you experience could be described in mathematical terms, but the experience itself is not maths. That's just a description of it. An amoeba has some degree of consciousness. One can describe the amoeba mathematically, but never completely, and never without some sort of problem. But maths is never perfect, is it not Gödel's theorem? And that mathematical process will not necessarily produce an amoeba or consciousness. An organism route to strong artificial intelligence. The brain is not a computer. The brain doesn't behave like a computer or like a machine. It behaves like an organism. It is holistic and operates as a field. Organisms are holistic and operate as fields. We know of no machine that displays consciousness, yet we see billions of organisms that do. But despite this, it is thought that better machines will lead to consciousness. That is a fundamental category error. To create strong artificial intelligence, this paper would propose that one must first make machines that are more like organisms, not just machines that might learn like an organism does, such as Google DeepMind's, but machines that actually are organisms in part. A super machine is likely to remain just that, a super machine, however impressive the functions it performs. Compute, computing is not thought. Any physical object can compute a result, like this, dropping this. It is the meaning of the computation which is interpreted by conscious thoughts. So thinking is experience, and there's a word I'm looking for that's that I can't quite find, but anyway, it'll come to me. A machine that has energetic and biological aspects just might cross over the border line into organism properties. However, it might even be possible that current artificial intelligence programming has already crossed over into the beginning of such properties. This is because one aspect of an organism is that it cannot be entirely predicted. Some types of artificial intelligence are already displaying aspects of this behaviour, and others too. Like, I think the algorithm type stuff, the neural networking, the partly biological computers, they're on the path. The people are aware. The people at the cutting edge of AI are aware that they need to mimic how organisms function, not how machines function. The people are have kind of grasped that to some extent. Most artificial intelligence currently in use utilizes algorithms that are specifically tailored to perform certain specific tasks very well, such as playing chess or recognizing shapes. In the case below, a set of neural pathways enables a computer to recognize different sets of patterns, illustrated as a simple neural network for enabling a computer to recognize when a line is horizontal. So I go through that, and then new types of algorithms are being created which are said to be able to learn in a general sense. So, and these are called artificial general intelligence, which Google DeepMind is developing. So they've got like networks that are self-reinforcing and sort of gradually improving its outcomes as it reaches goals. So heading towards goals is an organism quality. And then I say a general intelligence is beginning to surface from such networks that calling them neural networks is a bit of a is a bit far fetched at the moment, but they're certainly trying to network them more and trying to, because the brain works as a field. It does, like a computer goes like this, making decisions, whereas the brain, everything works together at the same time as a field. That's one of the problems with mechanistic theories of consciousness, is we've never found, like in a computer, you've got a memory stored in a specific place, as a change in the patterns of gates, whereas we've never been able to find a parallel to that in the brain. Yes, certain areas of the brain are involved, but it's almost like a radio tuning into radio waves in some ways. It's not like a computer accessing hard etched in memories in its circuit board. So I've just summarised the qualities of current artificial general intelligence, which appears to be heading in an organism direction. So I'll list these. Self-adaptive neural networking of algorithms is already appearing to have some organism properties. So some of these are: the results are not entirely predictable. It can learn and generalize to a limited extent. Changes in its programming occur more holistically, working as a field. It has internal goals like an organism does, rather than externally set tasks like a machine. The programs are given some autonomy to find, digest, and react to information like an organism would do. It is multi-connective. Actual hardware in microchips is becoming more like a biological neuron. For example, some circuits can perform transistor and memory functions at the same time and have more than the 1 or 0 positions of traditional computer microcircuitry. So that's going a little bit towards quantum computing there, whereas it won't just be on or off at the gates stored in the computer. It will have a number of different functions, so one off or one and on and off, or neither on or off all at the same time. Prioritizing coherence. A biological neuron will give priority to messages that are more in tune, and some computer chips are now working in the same way. The above is sometimes called neuromorphic computing. So anyway, although current sort of what is termed AI, but really I call it artificial cleverness rather than intelligence, because intelligence suggests that there is something that is aware, and something that has what's that word I'm looking for? Cognition. You can't say, well, you got a little bit of cognition. I mean, you can have. There is many grades of cognition, but something's either on the cognition scale or not. So to call something, anyway, we've gone over that before, so I'll forget that. AGI is clearly artificial general intelligence. It's clearly headed in an organism-like direction. Perhaps it might be developing a very limited proto-consciousness already. And then I talk about creating an organotic intelligence. So originally the goal of this author was to examine if Orgone itself was possessed of consciousness. So my driving thing, I have to get a cushion because this chair's a bit hard. My driving force really I've always, since about 2000, I've been very focused on orgone research since I did my masters in acupuncture and orgone. That drive towards researching orgone has gradually gone towards the one area of orgonomy that it was entirely incomplete or entirely lacking, which was how orgone relates to consciousness. Reich hardly scratched the surface of that, really. So that's why I've been focused on that area for the last 10 years or so, maybe. Bit less, perhaps. Pardon me. Over some years, the realization dawned that the only way to achieve this was to make the orgone itself talk, independent of any other entity. Anything less would just be a demonstration of the consciousness of an organism that already exists. So how would one go about creating strong artificial intelligence from an orgone point of view? So I talk about how orgone appears to be both the energy which powers organism and which may itself be responsible for their consciousness. This is not completely proved, but the paper proposes that orgone is the best and only physically detectable candidate we have for a universal field of consciousness. If it is the orgone energy that powers organisms, and organisms are always associated with consciousness, the goal would kind of be to create an artificial organism. Create an artificial organism and the consciousness will take care of itself. And then I propose that we'd need an artificial high concentration of orgone energy with a periphery and a core. This would mimic the basic characteristics of the simplest organism known to orgonomy, the bion. bion is composed of just a membrane and internal plasma, though it lacks a central core. Well, we're, we don't know a lot about bions, but they appear not to have a central core mostly. Even a bion as the simplest organism would likely have some level of consciousness, as consciousness appears to be a universal characteristic of organisms. All organisms maintain a significantly higher orgone charge than their environment, so that would need to be mimicked. So we'd need a high charge contained orgone field with an outer periphery and a central core. The orgone consciousness unit would preferably create its own power supply in the region of millivolts. All organisms create their own bioelectric power. Organisms appear to work on a trilateral basis, a non-energy consciousness field translating into orgone energy. The consciousness field is still orgone, but it goes from orgone consciousness into orgone energy, which translates itself into electromechanical movement. There are parallels between this and the orgone motor, which is based on the translation of orgone energy into electrical and then mechanical energy. The principle of action of the orgone motor has been evidenced experimentally by Maglione and also described by Southgate. So you can, if you go to Psych Orgone and look up the paper, it's references 5 and 6 for the orgone motor. So the pattern of these self-generated electrical energies in the core of the orgone consciousness apparatus could be monitored and thus supply the information out. The information out could be utilised within conventional neural network types of weak artificial general intelligence, or in other ways. Electrical observation devices and other inputs could be attached to the central core of the organotic unit, blah blah blah. So basically, I'm saying that we'd get a very strong concentration of orgone with an outer membrane, and that the patterns of movement and if you compress orgone enough, it starts to turn into electrons and create electrical activity. That seems pretty much the likely path that Maglione and myself and others have seen, and overviewing what is known about the orgone motor and the electrical research in orgone that's been done since, which is mostly on Psych Orgone too. But so if you got like every organism has a periphery. But most complex organisms, I mean, sometimes simple ones don't have a core, but complex organisms do have a core. Like I've got a number of different cores. So to make an artificial organism, we need a periphery, a core, which could be a crystal. We'd need a very high orgone charge, a crystal, or perhaps some other kind of container of orgone where the consciousness could attach to, and then the patterns of the patterns within that orgone field would then be monitored in some way, turned into electrical activity or turned into mechanical activity, and then those patterns would form the information out. Like I did suggest ways of getting the information in this paper, but that was pretty basic. I've moved on since then. I think if you're basically interacting with an energy entity, that a technological energy entity, that it you're not just going to be going, hello, how are you, enter. It's going to be a bit more weird than that, I think. Anyway, that's basically the idea. So yeah, here's to the future. It's going to be weird. Bye for now. And thanks for watching, and see you next month. I'm going to be doing what we're doing next month. Let's have a look. Probably go on to one of my more. I'm going to do probably a more technical experimental paper next one. Yeah, I think it'd be the further one of the first Orgone report. Yeah, preliminary experiments with electrical capacitance, temperature, radioactivity, luminescence, and other observations associated with controlled Orgone in a strong orgone device. Now that sounds fun, doesn't it? I mean, that's better than Coronation Street any day. So have a good month, and see you next month. And thank you for watching, oh viewer, and bye for now.